The tattoo and the challenge. Jackson Hale stood in front of the sleek, chrome mirror, his reflection a stark contrast to the shimmering holographic designs surrounding him. He had never considered getting a tattoo before, not out of reluctance, but because he hadn't really thought about it. Humans, after all, were often too busy surviving, fighting wars, or making history to focus on body art. But now, at Utopia Academy, on the tranquil planet of Virides 4, things were different. Here, in this peaceful pocket of the galaxy, humans were a curiosity, an enigma for many. He glanced over his shoulder at the small crowd of alien students gathered behind the glass wall of the tattoo parlor. They weren't sneaking glances, but they weren't exactly being discreet either. The Eocean girl, with her translucent skin and shimmering blue veins, stared with wide eyes. A Phyrene, one of the fiery, scale-covered species, shifted nervously, its hot breath fogging up the glass. And then there was Tylus Var, the Zerkian, whose eyes were narrowed with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. Jackson chuckled to himself. He knew exactly what they were thinking. Why would a human willingly put themselves through pain? He didn't care. His hand rested against the cold surface of the chair, the steady hum of the parlor's machinery buzzing in the background. The tattoo artist, a small, insectoid creature with glowing antennae, adjusted the needle with surgical precision. "Ready?" the artist asked, its voice a pleasant trill that was oddly soothing. Jackson took a deep breath, feeling the heat from the Phyrene's breath outside the glass. "Yeah," he said with a grin. "Let's do this." The first prick of the needle didn't hurt, not at first. It was a brief sting, like the sharp scrape of a thorn brushing against skin. But the tattoo artist's precision was flawless, and as the ink began to form the intricate lines on Jackson's arm, the sensation shifted. The needle began to press deeper, the pain intensifying, and Jackson could hear the murmurs of disbelief from the alien onlookers outside the glass. The Phyrene's breath hitched in shock. This was what they couldn't understand, Jackson realized. Humans experienced pain, sure. They felt it. But they didn't break. The pain grew. It wasn't unbearable, but it was a steady, uncomfortable throb that gnawed at the edges of his focus. But his face remained impassive. A bead of sweat trickled down his forehead, but his eyes were steady, fixed on the flickering neon lights on the wall across from him. The Eocean girl pressed her palm to the glass, eyes wide with fascination. Jackson's lips curled into a smile. He had spent years pushing his body beyond what most would consider sensible, whether it was through battlefields, harsh climates, or training routines designed to make his muscles scream for mercy. Pain was something humans had learned to adapt to. "Does it hurt?" a voice came from behind the glass. It was Tylus Var, his sharp Zerkian features forming a tight, unreadable mask. His tone was flat but tinged with something like amusement. Jackson turned his head just enough to meet Tylus's gaze. "Not as much as you'd think." There was a flicker of something in Tylus's eyes, doubt, maybe, or perhaps it was just disdain. The Zerkians, despite their resilience and toughness, didn't quite understand the human capacity for endurance. Jackson could sense it. The idea that a species like his could choose to endure something like this seemed absurd to them. It was almost as if they believed humans avoided pain entirely, that the concept of willingly subjecting oneself to discomfort was a strange anomaly. But Jackson didn't avoid it. He embraced it. The artist adjusted the needle once again, and the next wave of pain flared through his arm like a series of hot pricks. His muscles twitched involuntarily, but his breath didn't catch. He'd been through worse, much worse. And yet, this strange sense of calm washed over him. Perhaps it was the weird, almost meditative state the pain induced, or maybe it was just his belief that a little discomfort never hurt anyone. "You're doing it wrong," Tylus said suddenly, his voice rising with a touch of annoyance, the alien's tail flicking behind him in irritation. Jackson raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond. Instead, he flexed his fingers in a slight but deliberate motion. The Phyrene outside, still watching him with curious intensity, seemed to bristle at the sight. The fire-breather's scales glowed faintly as it shifted its weight, probably expecting Jackson to flinch or cry out. But Jackson wasn't that kind of human. He wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. He wasn't here to play the part of the weakling alien species thought they could easily conquer with their superior physical traits. No, Jackson was here to show them that humans were different. That they could endure. You see, Jackson began, his voice casual despite the discomfort, this is what makes us human. It's not about avoiding pain. It's about how we choose to handle it. He shot a glance at the window, locking eyes with Tylus. Sometimes, pain is a reminder that we're alive. Tylus didn't answer, but Jackson caught the slight narrowing of the Zerkian's eyes. Tylus wasn't convinced. Of course, he wasn't. In the Zerkian worldview, pain was something to be avoided at all costs. They built themselves to be tough, to resist the world around them. But humans, Jackson knew, had learned to bend without breaking. The buzzing of the needle continued as the tattoo neared its completion. Jackson's arm was already pulsing with a dull ache, but he wasn't about to stop. A quick glance at the alien students revealed a mix of fascination, confusion, and the slightest bit of awe. They didn't get it, but that was okay. Almost done, the artist chirped, its antennae flickering with concentration. You're doing great. Jackson smiled. The pain flared once more, a sharp bite against his skin. But it was nothing he couldn't handle. Thanks, he muttered. The last line of ink was drawn across his skin, and the needle's hum died down. The artist stepped back, admiring its work. Finished, it said, tapping Jackson's arm gently to ensure the ink had set. Jackson stood and flexed his arm, letting the cool air of the parlor wash over his skin. He could feel the tightness in his muscles, the lingering ache. But it wasn't anything he couldn't walk off. He grinned, catching sight of Tylus, still watching with skepticism etched on his face. See? Jackson said with a wink. Pain is just a part of the ride. As he walked toward the exit, his arms still tingling with the aftereffects, Jackson couldn't help but feel a certain satisfaction. The aliens hadn't understood it before. But now they'd seen it. He'd shown them that the human spirit was as strong as the flesh, if not stronger. And maybe, just maybe, they'd start seeing humans for what they truly were. Not fragile, not weak. Resilient. Tylus's eyes followed him, calculating, skeptical. But Jackson didn't need his approval. He already knew what humanity was capable of. Jackson Hale's footsteps echoed through the long hallways of Utopia Academy, the weight of each step heavier than it had ever felt before. The academy, with its pristine walls of gleaming glass and polished chrome, looked almost too peaceful. The gardens outside were serene, with strange alien flowers blooming in a kaleidoscope of colors, and the distant hum of spacecraft engines added an oddly soothing undertone to the campus. Yet, despite the calm atmosphere, Jackson felt the tension that had begun to coil in his gut. Tylus Var was making good on his challenge. The Zerkian's words from the tattoo parlor still lingered in Jackson's mind, let's see how long your human spirit lasts when it's really tested. Now, the time for talk was over. Tylus had set up a series of tests, each one designed to expose the limits of human endurance. Some would push Jackson physically, others mentally, but all were designed with one clear goal, to show that humans, despite their apparent resilience, would break under pressure. Jackson found himself standing at the entrance to the first test chamber, a massive, cylindrical room that smelled faintly of ozone. The walls were lined with panels that pulsed with a soft, blue light. The door slid open as he approached, and inside, the air was thick with the scent of synthetic cold. A chill ran through him, but he steeled himself, pushing past the discomfort. Tylus stood on the other side of the room, his posture proud and almost smug. The Zerkian's reptilian features glimmered under the light, the sharpness of his eyes betraying his anticipation. Ready for the first test? Tylus asked, his voice low and deliberate. He didn't wait for an answer, though, he never did. This is a temperature tolerance challenge. You'll be submerged in a cryogenic field. You'll experience freezing temperatures far below what a human should survive. We'll see how long you last. Jackson didn't flinch. He had faced cold before, on war-torn planets, in sub-zero training camps, in the frozen depths of the Arctic. This wouldn't break him. He squared his shoulders, meeting Tylus's gaze. "Let's get it over with," Jackson said, his voice steady. The temperature control systems in the chamber whirred to life, and a mechanical arm descended, attaching a cold metal collar around Jackson's neck. A strange blue light flickered, and suddenly, a wave of icy cold washed over him, as though the very air had turned to ice. It wasn't just cold. It was biting, sharp, the kind of cold that sliced through flesh and straight into bone. The first seconds were bearable. Jackson's breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, his skin prickling as the cold seeped deep. His hands trembled slightly, but he gritted his teeth, focusing on his breathing. He wouldn't break. He had to prove it. Minutes passed. His muscles began to stiffen, the cold gnawing at his extremities, numbing his fingers and toes. His vision blurred at the edges, and his skin, once warm and flush, was now a sickly shade of pale. The pain was starting to claw its way into his consciousness, but still, he refused to give in. Tylus watched from the control booth, his expression unreadable. Through the glass, Jackson could see the alien students gathering, their faces pressed up against the windows. Most were quiet now, eyes locked on him with a mixture of disbelief and growing respect. Jackson's breaths grew ragged, his chest feeling tight as though the very air had thickened into a frozen fog. He closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to focus. The cold was unrelenting, a constant barrage against his will. But his thoughts drifted to the countless battles humans had fought through history. Freezing temperatures, starvation, the endless push to survive. Pain was a part of it, always. But it wasn't the end. Not for humans. Just when his mind began to waver, the temperature began to rise again. The cold released its hold, but Jackson's body trembled uncontrollably, the sudden warmth flooding him like a wave of fire. "Done," Tylus's voice crackled through the comms, though there was no triumph in his tone. "You survived." "Barely." Jackson stepped forward, shaking slightly from the residual cold that clung to his body. He didn't speak immediately, but the pride in his chest was undeniable. The first test was complete, and he had passed. The next test came soon after, and it was even more brutal. The room was dimly lit, its walls lined with strange, biomechanical contraptions. Tylus's grin was wide, sharp, and cruel as he introduced the challenge. "This one will test your physical endurance," he said, gesturing to a mechanical device in the center of the room. It looked like a cross between a giant treadmill and a metal cage, suspended from the ceiling. "You'll run at full speed. The machine will simulate an environment where your body is under maximum stress, pushing you to exhaustion." Jackson nodded. He had run countless miles before, but this was different. He could feel the weight of Tylus's gaze, the weight of every alien student watching. He was going to prove them wrong, to show them what humanity was capable of. He climbed onto the machine and strapped himself in. It began with a slow pace, his feet padding softly against the treadmill. His body, still stiff from the cold chamber, protested. But he pushed forward, ignoring the tightness in his muscles. The pace quickened. The incline rose. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. The machine was relentless, feeding off his fatigue as it pushed him further and further. The strain on his legs grew unbearable, the burn of lactic acid building in his muscles until they screamed for mercy. But Jackson didn't stop. He focused on the rhythm of his steps, on the pumping of his heart, the steady flow of breath in and out. Survive, adapt, endure. It was the mantra that had carried humanity through every trial. The speed increased again. His heart hammered against his chest, but Jackson wasn't about to falter. His vision blurred, the world around him spinning as exhaustion threatened to overtake him. But the thought of the aliens, watching with their smug expressions, fueled him. If he stopped now, they would win. Minutes became hours, the treadmill blurred beneath his feet, his body feeling like it was on fire, each step a war between his muscles and his mind. And then, just as the machine reached its highest setting, the lights flickered and the machine powered down. Jackson collapsed forward, gasping for air, his body trembling from the effort. Impressive, Tylus said, his voice low, but there was no admiration in it. But not enough. Jackson didn't have the strength to respond. His chest heaved with every breath, but inside, something had shifted. The exhaustion didn't matter. The burn in his muscles didn't matter. He had endured, and that was enough for now. As he stumbled toward the exit, the alien students were silent. For the first time, Jackson caught a glimmer of something new in their eyes. Not pity. Not disdain. But something approaching respect. Tylus watched him, expression unreadable. But Jackson knew one thing for sure, this wasn't over. The real battle was only just beginning. Jackson woke to the soft hum of artificial gravity adjusting around him. The chamber was colder now, and the air smelled sterile, almost metallic. The first 2 tests had been grueling, each one designed to push him to the edge of his limits. The temperature test had nearly frozen him solid, and the physical endurance challenge had pushed his body to the point of collapse. Yet, despite the burning ache in his muscles, despite the bone-deep fatigue, Jackson had made it through. But there was still one test left. As he stood and stretched, he caught sight of the reflection of his tattoo, still vibrant across his arm. It was a reminder of the pain he'd already endured, of the human spirit's ability to persist. He had earned that mark, just as he was earning his place among these alien spectators, each one expecting him to fail. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and there stood Tylus Var, his posture as unyielding as ever. The Zerkian's cold gaze met his, and for a brief moment, Jackson saw something flicker there, perhaps it was admiration, though it was quickly masked by a steely indifference. "It's time," Tylus said, his voice laced with an edge of finality. "The last test. This one is mental." Jackson raised an eyebrow. Mental? He was prepared for physical agony, for endurance, but the mind? He had never backed down from a challenge, and this was no different. He squared his shoulders, meeting Tylus's gaze. "Let's get on with it." Tylus didn't waste time with words. He motioned to a nearby console, and a small holographic display flickered to life above it, showing a series of complex patterns, flashing bright against the dark background. "You will solve this," Tylus said. "If you fail, you will feel the consequences." Mental strain. In the past, humans have not been able to handle this type of challenge. They break. We'll see if you can prove otherwise. The alien's words lingered in the air, heavy with disdain. Tylus's tone suggested a finality, an expectation that Jackson would falter. The mental tests used in the academy were designed to test the limits of intelligence and decision-making under pressure. To most species, the mental strain could be overwhelming. But Jackson wasn't just any human. He had seen his comrades push through the most trying conditions, and he knew what was at stake here. This was his final test, not only for himself but for humanity. The display projected multiple colored shapes, each one pulsing and shifting at varying speeds. As the patterns sped up, Jackson could feel his mind racing to keep up, trying to process every shift, every change in the sequence. His heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the sharp focus required to track each pattern, to connect them before they blended into chaos. It wasn't just about solving a puzzle. It was about staying grounded, maintaining focus, and preventing his mind from collapsing under the pressure. For most, the sensory overload would have been debilitating, but Jackson's military training had taught him how to ignore the distractions, how to breathe through the chaos. He inhaled deeply, his gaze fixed on the screen. The shapes morphed into spirals and angles, twisting and turning in erratic directions. The pressure mounted, but Jackson's thoughts remained steady. He had faced the worst: ambushes, war zones, hostile planets. The mind was the final frontier. He had never backed down before, and he wasn't going to now. The first few sequences made sense. He followed the patterns, clicked them in order as the colors shifted rapidly. But then, the display began to pulse faster, the colors blending into a blur, and his vision flickered. The human mind, at its peak, wasn't meant to process so much so quickly. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop, to let the weight of the mental strain take over. But Jackson gritted his teeth and refused to give in. He had seen soldiers break under less. He had seen comrades fall apart at the slightest hint of stress. He had seen others crack when faced with what they thought was impossible. But not him. Not today. As the shapes flickered faster, Jackson's eyes started to burn, his temples throbbing from the intense concentration. His fingers itched to reach for his temples, to massage away the tension, but he couldn't afford to break his focus. Sweat trickled down the side of his face, and every part of him screamed to surrender to the overwhelming pressure, but Jackson refused. Endure. Adapt. Survive. Focus, he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the relentless hum of the holographic display. The pattern shifted, changed again, and something inside him clicked. There was a rhythm to the chaos. A pattern in the madness. His eyes snapped from one shape to the next, following the flow, clicking with precision. Suddenly, the sequence stopped. The display froze. The room fell into an eerie silence, and for a brief moment, Jackson thought he might have failed. The sensation of crushing mental pressure still lingered at the edges of his consciousness, but the puzzle, no, the challenge, was over. Tylus's voice cut through the stillness. Impressive, he said, though his tone was still hard to read. But not enough. Jackson stood up straighter, his pulse hammering in his chest. The words stung, but they were not unexpected. There was always something more, something that tested you even further. Tylus was relentless. His eyes locked onto Jackson's as the alien stepped forward, the smirk on his face returning. The true test is not how you handle the challenges, Tylus said, his voice low and calculating. It's how you deal with the consequences. With a snap of his fingers, the lights in the room dimmed, and a low hum filled the air. Jackson felt the ground tremble beneath him. The walls, once calm and serene, now rippled with an unnatural intensity. Tylus motioned toward the far end of the chamber, where a massive, cylindrical tank began to rise from the floor. It was filled with swirling liquid, thick and black like tar, and in its depths, something stirred. Jackson's breath caught as the shape of a creature emerged from the liquid. It was a monster, massive, hulking, and armored with jagged scales that glinted under the harsh lights. The creature's eyes, red and glowing with malevolent intelligence, locked onto Jackson's form. What the hell is that? Jackson's voice was steady, though his pulse quickened. A final test, Tylus said with a cold smile. Survive. Kill it. Or you fail. Jackson's jaw clenched as the creature roared, its claws scraping against the floor. It was clear now, the last test was not about endurance or intelligence. It was about survival, pure and simple. He had made it through the mental strain, the physical agony. But now, he had to face a real, tangible challenge, one that would test every part of him. He turned, readying himself. He wasn't just going to survive this test. He was going to prove to Tylus, to the entire academy, that humanity was more than just resilient. It was unstoppable.